Afternoon, everyone. Could I invite you all to come up? I promise I can't see you back there, so you won't be able to engage in the discussion. So if you could please just move up, and our speakers will be better able to see you because they do have these lights here that sort of make it difficult to see back there. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for our Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding event. My name is Shahrazad Hirad, and I'm a Communications Program Assistant in the Wilson Center's Africa program. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today for our panel on building peace in the Central African Republic, the role of agricultural extension services. I would also like to welcome all those joining us online via webcast and on Twitter. You can follow the live tweets of today's event by following the Africa program on Twitter at Africa Up Close, and you can contribute to the discussion by using the hashtag food security, all one word. Today, we have assembled a fantastic group of speakers to help us assess the causes of insecurity in the Central African Republic, its impact on agriculture and food security, and to consider options, including agricultural extension programs for enhancing food security as part of the Central African Republic's return to peace. It is my honor today to introduce our speakers. Dr. Jessica Anderson is a conflict advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development and a recent IIE Democracy Fellow in Conflict, Fragility, and Peacebuilding. She has 12 years of experience working on issues of aid, conflict, and displacement. This includes founding a startup to support post-conflict aid efforts, independent consulting, and serving as a fellow at the Stimson Center. She holds a PhD in political science, as well as MAs in political science and forced migration, and a BA in international relations. Mr. Michel Mbe is the program manager for the Central African Republic at the Search for Common Ground. He has over 10 years of experience managing projects in conflict, humanitarian, and development settings. He currently leads various projects and efforts to engage faith actors and the media throughout the Central African Republic. Father Patern Mumbe is one of the Africa Program's 2019 Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Scholars, affiliated with the SVMP member organization CERUP, Center for Research and Action for Peace. Father Pat is currently pursuing a PhD at Tangaza University College in Nairobi, Kenya, where his studies focus on social transformation and sustainable development. He has served as director of the Educational Center in Chad, director of the Loyola Hope Center's HIV and AIDS project in Togo, and director of the African Jesuits AIDS Network in Kenya. He holds a BA in philosophy, a BSc in biochemistry and microbiology, an MA of divinity in theology, and an STL degree in moral theology. Hailing from the Central African Republic, Father Pat is a priest in the Jesuit Order of the Catholic Church. His research focuses on the role of agricultural extension in promoting food security and rural development in post-conflict communities, specifically within the context of the Central African Republic. With that, I would now like to turn over the proceedings to Dr. Monday Moyangwa, Director of the Africa Program, to moderate this event. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Shahrazad, and good afternoon, everyone. I wish to join Shahrazad in welcoming you to this Wilson Center event on the Central African Republic with a specific focus on the role of agriculture in peace building in that country. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, we were chartered by Congress as an official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We're the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue aimed at informing actionable ideas for the policy community. The Africa program works to support the Wilson Center's mission by focusing on three main goals. First, we work to address the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations. Secondly, we work to build mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa relations. And third, we work to increase knowledge and understanding about Africa here in the United States. Today's event, being held under the banner of the Southern Voices Network Today's event is being held under the banner of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, which was established in 2011 with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. It is a continent-wide network of African policy, research, and academic organizations that work with the Wilson Center's Africa program to bring African knowledge, analysis, and perspectives to inform U.S., African, and international policy on peacebuilding in Africa. One of the main components of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding is a research scholarship program whereby scholars from African member organizations are hosted at the Africa program for a 3-month-long resident scholarship to work on an issue related to peacebuilding in Africa, to interact with policymakers and subject matter experts here in Washington on their chosen research topic. Today's event features one of our 2019 SVNP scholars, Father Pat Mombe, who will share the results of his research with us. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I want to take a minute or so to set the stage for a discussion on the Central African Republic. Many of you are here because you have a good grounding in the Central African Republic and where it has come from since independence. But hitting the high points, or the low points, as one might say, is that the Central African Republic has struggled with governance and with recurrent conflict since it gained independence. The current cycle of conflict re-emerged in 2012 and has continued on and off since then. In spite of the peace agreement signed between the government and 14 armed groups in February, the situation remains incredibly fragile, and outbreaks of conflict and violence continue. Needless to say, this war has devastated the country. In addition to thousands killed, the UN estimates that there are over 600,000 IDPs, that's internally displaced persons, in the Central African Republic, and over 2.9 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. And over a third of the children in the Central African Republic are not going to school. Much of the country remains under the control of the various armed groups, with access to public services extremely limited, even in some of the areas under government control. The conflict has also devastated the Central African Republic agricultural production. As of June 2019, it was estimated that 1.8 million people, fully 41% of the country's population, were facing severe food insecurity, which has also contributed to the continuing vicious cycle of instability and insecurity. So how do you build peace and assure food security in such an environment? And what role does agriculture play in the peace-building processes in general, and in the Central African Republic in particular? It is easy to be all doom and gloom about the Central African Republic, but I think we owe it to that country and to the people who are currently suffering under the weight of that conflict to be forward-leaning in our thinking and interrogating the peace-building frameworks that we have, and thinking through how we could do things differently to better bring about a sustainable peace in the Central African Republic. And so we've asked our speakers here today to not just talk about the frameworks, to not just talk about the challenges, but also to offer some concrete and practical recommendations for the way forward. And I have no doubt, given their commitment to the issue of peace building, that we shall hear plenty of that from them. And with that, I would now like to invite Dr. Anderson to help us think through and understand a little bit more about frameworks for peace building in fragile context, and how agriculture and food security fit into those frameworks. And we hope that she will be able to share with us not just the theoretical frameworks, but also lessons learned from other regions. With that, Dr. Anderson, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I wanted to start off by saying Father Patern's research couldn't be more timely. Last year, every country in the world where hunger levels, every country in a protracted food crisis was also engaged in violent conflict. Hunger is on the rise for the first time in decades, with conflict as a key driver. These trends mean that in many places, like CAR, we're facing a dual imperative to promote food security and build peace. So my role here is to shed light on this global picture, the connections between conflict and food systems on the one hand, and what they mean for building peace. I'm hoping the trends and examples I share here will shed light on what is possible in CAR. Now, we know more and more about the feedback loop between conflict and food insecurity. When conflict strikes, it severely disrupts agriculture and food systems. Farmers cannot plant and they cannot access markets. They often cope in dangerous ways, like selling off assets quickly and also eating less. And we know that conflict impacts wages, extension services, and inputs too. Food insecurity can in turn drive conflict by motivating rebel recruitment. This means that this awful cycle undermines prospects for both peace and well-being. So I know the question on our minds is, what do we do? How do we channel our knowledge here into creative programming that builds both sustainable food systems and peace? To organize our thinking here, I'll frame the session with 3 key areas that I think matter most for gearing food and agricultural investments to contribute to building peace. Now first, as a baseline, and as something I think many of us in the room know, we need conflict sensitivity and do no harm. This means that we need to avoid the unintended consequences of our work at all costs. First, by understanding the context really carefully and then adapting accordingly. But this importantly means we also need to understand the political economy of the places we're working in. And that means thinking about interests and incentives and power dynamics that are guiding behavior. Second, and related, practitioners need to take their knowledge of the context and channel it towards operational plans and strategies that make sense for unpredictable and fast-moving environments. We need new and better tactics for adaptive management, and we need to be truly set up to pivot as environments change quickly. And finally, and what I think matters most here today, is this idea that we can leverage food and agricultural investments towards peace-building goals, but in order to do so, we need to design carefully and creatively. Interventions first need to be tailored to the unique features of each conflict and context. There's a very good chance a successful intervention from a stable country doesn't make sense in Mali or Somalia. But what we need to be thinking about is when we're thinking about evidence-based programs, they need to be evidence-based based on similar conditions and then relentlessly ground-truthed. So the first step for doing this is to identify the key factors behind conflict and fragility in a place like CAR. Common drivers that we see around the world include inequality across groups, resource competition, weak governance, and lack of trust. Then we need to think about how we can address these factors in our programming design. We can do this by creating what I call peace dividends. So for example, promoting social cohesion and collective action can produce these dividends. An intervention, an agriculture or food security intervention, can create connections between groups and build trust. For instance, a strategically placed borehole can increase connections between communities. Support for a community land trust can create new rules for sharing land between farmers and pastoralists. And sometimes these efforts can rekindle a past behavior too. So for instance, in Nigeria and other places, herds often used to graze on leftover crops and then add manure to fields. But these symbiotic relationships have faded over time in some places. USAID is exploring ways to rekindle this relationship by creating market linkages where herders sell manure to farmers. This is increasing trust and strengthening ties across these groups. Now, another key area is efforts that build trust between citizens and government around shared problems create these peace dividends too. So any positive engagement between citizens and the state can start to strengthen the social contract. This can be as simple as increasing the flow of information and creating positive interactions with government in everyday life. Agricultural extension services, which we'll hear more about shortly, are a great example of this. Another example comes from Darfur, where a water catchment project brought together community councils from many villages so they could decide together the best way to use their new water resources. Another set of committees in this intervention then focused on engaging with the government. So you had both bridging capital and different kinds of capital that would link up with government. In a context of resource scarcity, this project helped to reduce tensions in some of the most tough circumstances imaginable. And in the end, it reduced conflict between pastoralists and farmers. Now, all of these examples I'm giving you, they have the benefit of promoting sustainable food systems while also creating peace dividends. And as I wrap up, I'd like to say, I find agricultural extension services very exciting because they have the potential to both improve agricultural productivity and contribute to peace building in post-conflict places. They can address these dual imperatives that we know matter so much in a lot of these places that are beset with both incredible food insecurity and instability. But agricultural extension services don't do this just because they are agricultural extension services. They do so because they do things like increase trust, share information, and create positive interactions with the state. We should be thinking in these kinds of contexts about how all of our investments can create peace dividends. This is sort of some low-lying fruit that we can take advantage of and really amplify in our work. We should strive to maximize impact within the realities of the context. Again, agricultural extension services are a great example. We can find a lot more. This might mean pursuing creative approaches that go outside of our traditional toolkit, and it means leveraging what is working well in that place. This could be local leaders that people really trust or a private sector actor that's working for the public good. And I'd like to leave with this idea that the aid community can amplify promising ideas, but locally driven approaches are crucial at the end of the day. So coming from USAID, it's our duty at USAID to leverage local knowledge, to lean in with creative approaches, and to seek peace dividends wherever we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Father Pat, talk to us about peace building and agricultural extension services in the Central African Republic. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this communication on Central African Republic. You are going to see maybe the map of the Central African Republic and place it somewhere in the world. Maybe to put you in context of a discussion in the context of peace building, what I can say is that I wish to build on the case of the Central African Republic there in red on the map to type in two major issues in peace building today, two major issue of major concern. First, the ongoing situation of conflict in some part of the world, basically in developing countries. We see new type of conflicts taking place, different from what the world had been experiencing in the past, which are characterized by the fact that they are mostly internal conflict, and internal conflict involving non-state actors with heavy weapon and all sorts of situation. And the key thing to notice with this type of conflict is that we are talking about conflict linked with poverty or hunger, or again, agriculture, development, or rather underdevelopment. The second issue, or the second key element which is of concern for the global society is the issue of food security. We know that for the past 3 years, the trend in the level of hunger, instead of decreasing, as we were expecting in line with the Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which invites us to work towards zero hunger, the trend is rather increasing. And it has been clearly established that the bigger the large number of people who are experiencing hunger today and who are increasing or reversing the tide are found in a country afflicted by conflict. So when we are talking about Central African Republic, we are also talking about these two issues which are of concern for the world. My core argument is to say that if we rejuvenate agriculture extension, eventually for many agriculture extension is old-fashioned, but if it is rejuvenated, it can give a certain hint to agriculture, allow agriculture development, and change the tide in rural areas where most of the food soldiers of conflicts or internal conflicts are found. So the case of Central Africa gives us a ground to see the situation in a particular way. And I would like to build on this case of Central Africa and kind of articulate my talk along 3 points. First, to touch the vicious cycle between conflict and hunger within Central African framework. And then highlight the pivotal role of extension in strengthening peace, lasting peace, and food security, and before ending with some policy recommendation. Coming to the vicious cycle of conflict and hunger, those who talked before me mentioned how the conflict started in Central Africa in 2012. Monday stressed it, and show also how this conflict did not go without affecting the food production in the country. What I can stress is the conflict which started at the beginning as a military political crisis evolved and kind of saw the intervention of another phase with the intervention of the Seleka, a kind of group which came in the picture to oppose a resistance to a bloody terror perpetrated by the Seleka, which opened again the floor to intercommunal violence. It's good to stress that because it tells how the impact of the crisis has touched the society and perceive the importance of agriculture extension in that line. And after the intercommunal violence, we had the situation of proliferation of armed groups who are occupying today 80% of the territory. They don't have a particular goal except that to make the maximum of money out of the natural resources of the country. And the last phase of the crisis is this peace agreement signed in February 2019 between the government and 14 armed groups. This peace building agreement opened the floor for maybe a new way of going about peace building in Central Africa. And the question for us is eventually to know or to ask how to go about. What we can say is that with the presence of the armed groups in the field, the impact on the food system, food security, and so on has been really huge. First, maybe some element of the humanitarian crisis that it has provoked. With the presence of the armed groups in the field, we have had 1.2 million of people displaced. Internally, 613,000, and outside as refugees, 600,993. That makes a percentage of 26% of the country, one quarter of the country. You can imagine one quarter of the country or population in the country who are not living in the regular setting. The impact on food security has reached also a level of 45%. It said that 45% of people in Central Africa are food insecure. A stronger point or a strong data to notice is also that with the presence of the armed groups, food production has failed by a factor of 65%. That tells we need years to be able to catch up with this impact. This only impact 65% of the level of food production in the country. And in addition to all this, Central African Republic has been identified by the Global Index, Global Hunger Index, as the hungriest nation for the 5 consecutive past years. Just to tell you that even though we have in the field organizations trying to intervene to bridge the gap of food insecurity or food security, the situation is still alarming. And 5 years has not been enough to change the situation. Going to how hunger can fuel conflict, especially in the context of Central African Republic. And eventually that could be one of the points to notice and kind of think into a future solution. When we think of the situation of Central African Republic, we have to bear in mind that the country has been living, the agriculture in the country has been underperforming. And this is due to some measures taken in the years 1970s, and which makes that the level of food production has been low despite the advantages in the country and so on. And the findings in researches today are telling us that underdeveloped agriculture is also a factor of conflict. It fuels hunger, it fuels poverty, and kind of prepare food soldiers in rural areas to join any rebellious movement to make to kind of destabilize a country. And this is eventually what has been the case for Central Africa, which has never experienced a decade without conflict for the past 40 years. How now to address this situation? Agriculture extension seems to be the appropriate solution. When you look at how peacebuilding had been implemented in Central Africa, addressing the past conflict I've referred to, most of the measures has been peace agreement, like the one we have now, with kind of allocation of ministerial posts, and eventually amnesty to the leaders of the rebel groups who have been kind of responsible of a crime against humanity. And if you see that this is just an elitist approach, no mechanism to reach out to those who are paying the heavy burden of this conflict, basically, especially people living in rural areas. With agriculture extension, we can reach out to them and make a difference in their life by transforming, by unlocking the potential of agriculture in Central Africa and allow them to produce more, to earn more, and to be able to resist to any call to join any movement and create instability in the country. Agriculture extension is not only about expanding productivity, it's not only about expanding rural livelihood, it is also about creating a social capital. Many scholars have stressed how agriculture extension allow to make easy the return of this internally displaced population or refugees, or even the insertion of ex-combatants in communities. And with the extension agents who would be kind of trained with some skills to facilitate dialogue and negotiation in communities, it's possible to create or to help strengthen this social capital to kind of come up and build a strong social cohesion. There's also the conflict between herder and farmers. If you look at the configuration of the conflict in Central African Republic, the background, you have one side, behind the Seleka, you have the herders mostly, and behind the Antibalaka, you have mostly the farmers. So with also the crisis which has reached the communal level and affected Christian and Muslim, this is also these two issues at stake. Farmers and the herders, Muslim and Christian, Seleka and Antibalaka. So extension agents can play key roles in making it possible. Let me now jump on the level of recommendation just to say that with this background and the situation in South Africa, we call for basically a shift of focus. Most of the money, for instance, when you look at the money given by the US government to the Central African Republic last year, most had been invested in emergency intervention. It is important for sure, but more need to be put now in development. And putting in development, agricultural development is a key element, and agriculture extension is a catalyst to that. We'd like also to invite eventually the government of Central Africa and the international community to create a conducive condition. The presence of the armed groups in the field is still a factor of food insecurity. They prevent people from going to do their farming activities. They put fees or taxes to be paid that makes that the food price increases. Sometimes they interfere with food distribution. So what is the point in keeping armed groups in the fields if they are not defending, I was going to say, a real case, let's say democracy at stake, or the interest of a particular group who is being marginalized and so on. So there's a need to get the armed groups, to find a strategy to get the armed groups out of the field. And I think by designing also a good plan for agricultural development, including agriculture extension, the sector can be attractive to the food soldiers of these armed groups for them to shift, and then we can have a more conducive condition. I guess the last point is to call on the support for agricultural development, to the support to shift. I mean, as I said, much focus has been put on emergency. Maybe it's time to put more money in development, particularly in agriculture, because the country is an agrarian economy country, and 70% of people rely on agriculture for their livelihood. So investing in extension in Central Africa appears eventually as a best bet to make peace and make possible a lasting peace. Thank you very much.
All right, so to round up our panel this afternoon, we have somebody who has practical on-the-ground experience from the Central African Republic, Mr. Mbe, who works with the Search for Common Ground. So I know you were just there last week, right? Please share with us some of the experiences.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll first of all start by saying that for each economic development to happen, for Central African Republic to have food security, as all of us want, people need to live in peace. People must have security to be able to go to their farms, to carry on the activities, to feed their families, and also to have access to basic social services, actually. We've been working, we are Search for Common Ground since 2014 in CAR. And one thing we can talk about now, 5 years after, is that we've been committed to support the country. And we have earned a unique level of trust and access at all levels of Central African leadership. At the national level with the parliament, because we have MOU agreement with authorities, state authorities, to carry on activities. With various ministry, department of government ministries, but also with state entities. At the local level, we usually engage youth, religious and traditional leaders across religious lines and local authorities as well. And so far, there have been welcoming activities. We have a unique approach, actually, which we call a common ground approach, which enables us for all parties in the conflict to understand their underlying needs and identify and build commonalities to foster trust and mutual respect, which are relevant and impactful to address social breakdown, mistrust, which is a reality in Central Africa, and division. And so far, we can admit that our work on the ground have gradually changed participant attitudes towards moving from enemies or opponents to who were competing for power and resources to partners in collaborating for sustainable development. I think this is an approach that can be put in place whenever we have to deal with any issue in a fragile state like Central African Republic. Through our intervention, we aim to establish and strengthen locally based structure that will last beyond our programs and allow for the sustainability of the activities. So beside this, we have supported the establishment of formal and informal structure on the ground. At the national level, we've been successfully working with the civil society platform and also with the local peace committees in Bangui and outside Bangui, and name some cities like Bambari and also northeast part of Cad in Delhi. And this structure has played a leading role in promoting community reconciliation and social cohesion. In 2014, it's anecdotal, the mining town of Yaloke, Search was the first organization to facilitate intercommunal activities, fostering nonviolence and social cohesion. I think that doing the link with extension, agricultural extension as a solution, in a country where food insecurity rate is a major concern, actually, I think one aspect that we should focus on is to work towards rebuilding trust and creating more space of dialogues in between those communities which are suffering of the side effect because the social fabric of the country has collapsed. So it's also relevant to build our capacity so that they should start talking to each other and building that trust. But also, we should not let behind the reality in the field that there are armed groups who most of the time prevent people to access to their basic services, to a livelihood, to develop their income. Given that existence, at a certain point, and given the situation and the emergency which is ongoing there can be an opportunity to work towards a mediation. The mediation work that we usually do, that is to have this kind of discussion with a non-state armed group in the country, in most of the part in CAR, so that they should understand and allow people to have access to their farms. That is very crucial, and that is a work that actually there's not a lot which have been done so far from my own experience in regard to that. The more focus was on saving lives. We all agree on that. But you cannot bring tons of rice and you want to distribute rice in a town like Batangafo, where you have people with guns and you want to focus on IDPs. They do no harm that they just mentioned earlier. It's very crucial. How we can better tailor activities that can fit with the current context so that it should not expose people, put them at risk, but rather helping them. We strongly think that this work can be also support with a social engaged media and art-based approach that we do at Search for Common Ground. Given the traditional media of radio, our innovative media and art-based approach, combining high-quality radio drama and talk shows, particularly mobile theater, cinema, mobile cinema, enable us to reach a large number of citizens. These complementary tools have allowed us to convey peace and social cohesion messages while providing public with meaningful platforms for engagement, allowing them to explore alternatives to violence and overcome stereotypes, prejudice, and division. We think that in regard to this topic, maybe some few bullet points as recommendation that we can formulate from now would be maybe to facilitate intercommunal dialogue, intercommunal activities in fostering nonviolence and social cohesion. Empower ex-combatants into farming that will help to contribute to ongoing critical processes like the DDR, which is very kind of another issue that the government is trying to deal with, which is not easy. And they hardly reach the number of targets of reinsertion soldiers that they are planning. And now it has been for the past 3 years. Maybe agricultural extension will be an opportunity to see how to involve them in the process as well, to think about them as well, and how they can leave their guns and maybe start a new life. That will also be relevant to empower communities to address their own grievances. That is in developing community-owned early warning mechanism to prevent violence. Because so far we think that when the community is well-trained to deal with the issue of violence at their own level, that will likely reduce the number of violence and conflict where they operate. And lastly, we think that improving agricultural productivity through the do no harm in the value chain might be very effective in order to have maybe look for a sustainable and long-lasting peace. But what I'd say to end up here is that there's a huge emergency to think through how we can create more space for dialogue for all the stakeholders whenever we need to address a crucial issue like agriculture in a fragile context like CAR. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I just got to turn this off. So thank you so much to all three of our speakers. I'm going to open this up to Q&A, but I wondered if one of you is prepared to talk more immediately about the causes of the insecurity and conflict, so we can have that as the backdrop to our discussion. Because understanding what the causes of the insecurity are, I think, allows us to identify the appropriate entry points that we have for engaging with that conflict. And I know we were very focused on the agricultural dimension of it, but just as a backdrop to our discussion, would one of you be prepared, maybe Michelle, can I give you a few minutes just to talk about, from your perspective, what do you see as the key causes and then the drivers of the conflict in the Central African Republic?
Yeah, actually, surely other panelists will certainly complete. Actually, from our own end, the key drivers comes from the territorial or geographical disparities, which have been incurred for, I rather say, since I'm tempted to say maybe since for decades now, close to 2 decades, that there are region in part in Car where they've never experienced some sort of important development. I mean, the first kind of reaction came from those regions. And the other, drivers that is commonly known is the struggle to control minerals as well, that have motivated many armed groups to take their gun and to try to fight and control vast lands in the country. And historically, when they think through, some observers will find some historical background within the conflict between, ethnical kind of antagonism between some groups. So maybe I can just leave that picture that way. Thank you.
You have anything to add?
Yes, just to add to this, my point that he made, I would say there's also a certain problem at the level of the type of governance in the past, which has tended to be a bit regional. And with this, some regions experience some element of marginalization. There also, as I said, the agriculture level in Central Africa is really low. And that's the vast majority of the population, 70% of people depending on it. So all the governance, all the policy in the past, basically a reform which was made in the 1970s, was shown as a kind of root causes of the decline of the economy. That makes that although agriculture is the core element in the economy, it was the return was not there, and then as a result, the government is not able to reach out to some regions, is not able to pay the civil servants and so on. And with this, a total weak state, which makes that the level of poverty is rampant and makes easy any reaction and so on. So, element of governance, I would add to it. Yeah.
So, look, I think what we're hearing here is, and I know we're all familiar with the situation in the Central African Republic, is that this is a nation that has struggled with the governance element of it. By no means unique to Central Africa. The nation-building exercise in Central Africa has been tough, as it has been in other countries, but unfortunately it has found seams and wedges that continue to exist, and in some cases perhaps even deepen. So we have that as the backdrop on the governance challenges, and then that has been layered in with the endowment of mineral resources that have brought in this greed element that has exacerbated those cleavages that were existing as part of the governance issue. You do have the government now that's trying to move things around with a peace agreement. So we will see how things proceed. The task ahead of them is definitely tough. And so with that, I will open up the floor to questions and comments. It's a tough environment. It's hard enough trying to build a peace when there is a peace to keep. You don't have a peace to keep in the Central African Republic. So we're talking about a really, really tough environment in which to try and create this peace and resuscitate the agricultural sector and bring others in. So let me just open this up for questions. Those of you who've been here know the drill. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. You'll get a mic. Identify yourself by name and the institution with which you're affiliated, if any, and then the speaker to whom you're directing your question, and you will have a minute to ask your question or make your comment. So let me start right here, and then I'll move to the lady right here and the gentleman right here. So right there, Gamu. Thank you.
Okay. Brian Bruns, independent consulting sociologist. I'd like to ask if they could lay out some examples of the kind of nuts and bolts of how this might work on the ground, and whether there are any examples, maybe in areas somewhat less affected by, the armed violence, but of changes that let farmers and herders both, go back and do more in agriculture in ways in which agricultural extension has specifically helped support that.
Did you want to take multiple questions?
No, I take 3 at a time.
My question is related
Who
to
are
that.
you?
Oh, I'm so sorry. My name is Madeline Valtero. I am with the Stimson Center. My research focuses on links between pastoralism and violence. And so my question is a bit related where, I noticed both Dr. Anderson and Mr. Mbe, when you were delivering your remarks, the examples you gave, which I think is common in the U.S., is of agriculture as farming, that farmers have difficulty accessing markets, that farmers have difficulty feeding their families. And I just wonder, considering agriculture does incorporate both farming and herding, but those are things that they have very diverse needs. Agriculture is not one thing, and it's a very diverse concept. How do we make sure that agriculture continues to mean these diversity of things and we're not accidentally privileging certain types of agriculture over others to the detriment of communities or to the detriment of the planet? And just a quick second question about if you see a role for foreign direct investment in this, or if you think that the capital should be mainly coming from the country or the region. Thank you.
Clovis Ballet. I'm a financial advisor, Washington Adventist University. I first going to give a little comment, then my question will be addressed to Mr. Michel. My comment is, what you say here was correct, because I'm from there, and there's a lot of disparity, and that's true. But what did you think of education as far as the rural part of Central African Republic? Because when people are educated, then they will understand what's going on. They will understand the change, and they will appreciate the change, and they will keep the change. But if they're not educated, would you think that however change you will bring in, it will be an issue to keep it? That's my question.
Okay. So what we will do is there were 3 or 4 questions actually. The one about where there are places perhaps that are a little bit secure, where this agricultural extension model that we are advocating here has actually worked, that we can draw on, whether it's within the Central African Republic itself, and I'd also like to hear from other places, but looking at the Central African Republic, can we look at pockets of insecurity and security and figure out where we might be able to focus those services and then perhaps work out, was one question. And then the second is, even as we look at frameworks and looking at how we might better incorporate agriculture into peace-building models, especially in countries and a continent that's so heavily dependent on agriculture, that agriculture is a core piece of how you define security. How do we make sure that our definition of agriculture is comprehensive enough so we are not privileging some communities or types of agriculture over others? And then the third being, is there a role for FDI? And then finally, the question about educational disparities and the role that they play in all of this. What I'm going to do is I'll just start with you, Michelle. Just bring it in. Give you each a couple of minutes to respond to any or all of the questions.
Okay, thank you. First of all, start with the question related to if we can have spaces where to implement. Mm-hmm. I will go from, my answer will be based from what is ongoing right now. From the past, I'd rather say 2 years. We noticed that the southwest part of CAR, for humanitarian and development actors who are on the ground, seems to be some sort of having a relative stability to carry on some activities whenever we want to think through maybe extension of agriculture. Because why observers see it that way? Those are parts of the country where we've not recorded some clashes as compared to the other areas of the country. But I rather just recall that that's what we also thought, let's say 2 months ago, before the outbreaks of violence in Northeast. Those were places where there were no kind of issues. So from my own end, I think that whenever we think through about tailoring program, we should have some sort of inclusive approach, in-depth knowledge analysis. I was mentioning the conflict, trying to understand the nuances of the conflict dynamics in the field is very relevant, and to see how we can better put in place program that can last. Yes. So that would be the first answer to that question. And answer related to the question regarding education is very true. There's the illiteracy rate in the country is an issue of major concern. But I also want to stress on the fact that every development will happen whenever people are safe and secure. Maybe to go to their farm, to go to school, to go to hospital, actually. So that's why we strongly believe that there's a lot of work to do, first of all, in terms of maybe winning peace that would help people to get access, first of all, to basic social services. Because we have all these kind of heavy rates, concerning rates in different social basic services which people are entitled to receive because actually they cannot afford it. And whenever humanitarian and development actors are there, maybe they cannot reach, they're not reachable. There's also another problem in regard to that. And whenever you think through maybe about having some sort of collaboration, I mean, making it look inclusive, thinking about ex-combatants, how they can be reinserted in agriculture. Those are very brilliant ideas. But I just want to remind that there's also, because we've been conducting in Bangui and in Bambari, town hall meetings with some communities. The most interesting part with this type of exercise is that you give voices, you give people the opportunity to speak, to talk. You give them the voices to be heard. It's during one exercise that I learned personally that there's a lot of land issues as well, because people have been displaced, leaving their land behind. And other people came to occupy the lands. Those are places like the Southwest that I was mentioning, which are relatively kind of calm. But there's this issue which is very rampant there, which can be a source of conflict as well. So we strongly think that it's good to there are emergencies, we agree on that, but it's good to look in the big picture in order to address the cause issue in Central Africa.
Okay.
The Republic. Thank you.
Thank you. Father Pat?
Mm-hmm. Yes, to respond to the preoccupation of Brian, adding to what he said, Southwest in Central Africa is the more stable area than the rest. But also some examples beyond the context of Central African Republic. It has been shown that in Mozambique, in 1994, after the peace accord, a program of extension has been put in place, and it has helped strengthen agriculture in the country and also stability in rural areas. There's also the case of Sierra Leone and Liberia, where also extension are being used to reach out to people who are going back to active life after a decade of conflict. And here again, it has played a key role, including for building the social cohesion, and the issue of trust, which has been mentioned by Michelle, is a reality, and it has been also a reality in Sierra Leone. And thanks to extension, basically run by private organizations there, World Vision to be specific, it has helped also build the trust and make possible social cohesion and skills for agriculture production and so on. To respond to Maria, in fact, we say agriculture, but we have to have in mind the whole component, the whole package. It's not only about farming, but it's also about livestock. It's agriculture and livestock and fishery. Okay, so but for the sake of communication, make it easy, then we use this agriculture. But of course, for sure, we have to. I should have just mentioned at the beginning that when I say agriculture, I mentioned these different dimensions as well. So this is what we have in picture, an extension that touches this level. Problem of education, as I stressed, in Central African Republic, for years, for the past 2 decades, basically, what we have been observing is that the government was less present in remote areas. So in rural areas, the level of education also has gone down. It's not only about agriculture, which has a kind of lost its kind of momentum, but also it's the whole sector of life, to the point that population in these remote areas felt marginalized. Those in the north felt that they were the most marginalized, but in many parts of the country, population were left to themselves or by themselves, and then armed groups started to come up and occupying this zone where the state was not there, and they merged to become Seleka. But first, the state was kind of going, and they say at some point, the government or the state in Central Africa was just by a radius of 100 kilometers, not beyond. Just to give you a picture, we are talking about a country which has more or less the size of Texas. So if the government can only run the country over a territory of 100, the rest, what is happening there, I mean, many things that happened and has affected, created ground for these armed groups to come and do what we are seeing today. So the working for peace building is eventually looking at all these pictures and see how to go about. But the interest of agriculture is eventually the number of people it's mobilized, the impact, where is the impact going to go? It's reaching out the bigger number of the population. And these are mostly the food soldiers, as I said. I keep insisting on that. And when you change at the grassroots, eventually the rest maybe will be more stable and so on. That's what I can add.
All right. Jessica, you want to touch on anything, or you?
Sure. I'll chime in on the question about including pastoralism. I thought that was a great point. I'm with the Center for Resilience at USAID, and we have 13 focus countries. Most of them are in arid and semi-arid land. So we're actually, when I say markets, I'm actually thinking about livestock markets perhaps first. And the same with inputs, whether it's feed or selling assets quickly, it's generally selling off livestock and things like that. So that is actually the context I'm probably more inclined to be thinking about, but it's super helpful to realize that doesn't come out clearly. I also try to talk about food systems too, instead of agriculture specifically, but again, it's helpful to know. I think if anything, I'm always vulnerable to forget about fisheries. That's my blind spot. But yeah, thank you for the question.
All right, so I know your question about FDI was not touched on, but that's fine. I think it gives us something to pursue and look into as we proceed with the research. Let me take another 3 questions. I'll go Nee over here. You're kind of like halfway up, halfway going. All right, I'll see the lady in the back and the gentleman right behind me, and then I'll take another round. I see you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nia Kwete. I'm a consultant, but I also happen to be a friend of the Africa program for Truth in Speaking. I think, of course, Central African Republic has had a very challenging independence with all the conflicts.
Yeah.
But frankly, I'll tell you that the presentation so far, I think is a little bit too pessimistic.
Okay.
Because yes, the country is struggling, but looking at Father Pat's research, I can tell you that my dominant feeling is excitement. If we can get the safety issue solved, I think what he's proposing is great. And my question is for Dr. Anderson, actually. You said that his research is timely. I will take it even further because I think it seems like the stars are aligned. Because if you're looking for agriculture in general, food systems, as well as extension, I think there is no better country to go to than the United States. I was telling Father Pat about America's muscular clout. I can't think of a country in the world that is stronger than the US if you look at all 193. So my question for you is, how can USAID pick up this issue of using extension, not only to build peace, but also address something like urbanization across Africa? People need food, and you have land-grant colleges and all that. So if I were to make you head of USAID and say, give us a brilliant program for taking this forward, could you please share some ideas?
Okay. Where's the lady in the back over there? And then the gentleman up here.
Hi, I am Esnia Bajavor. I am with the American Association for the Advancement of Science in research publication. My question, I want to know if you can speak more to migration patterns and how that influences tension amongst displaced people, displaced persons within CAR, and how what form of regional corporations exist in terms of combating these tensions, and if you see an opportunity if you see a benefit in regional cooperation with centered around agricultural extension, and if you see a benefit in that kind of mitigating any insecurities among different displaced persons.
Okay, thank you. And then this gentleman up here. Steve, I think. Oh, right there.
Steve Landy from a new company, MT African Invest. I'm here with Polly Matumbo, who's probably the biggest expert on investing in CAR. So let me just make a short comment, and then I'm going to let Polly focus on the question. You know, you guys do a great job at the Wilson Center. If I go to another lecture about Kenya or Ghana, I think I'm going to be unhappy. And the fact that you bring up these topics that people don't follow regularly and bring them center stage in Washington is definitely very much appreciated by us. So I thank you very much. And with having said that, I'll let Polly explain a little bit about private sector and some of the things we're thinking about. I'll also ask a question.
Thank you very much. I'm Paulie Mutombo, MT African Invest, and I'm also a professor for computer science. The model we have is a comment, and then I'm going to ask a question. The model we have for Central African Republic is in three sectors. Economic development, we're going to target energy, education, and agriculture. And we have a group of 5 investors. We're going to be traveling to Central African Republic next month. In the term of education, as a professor, I will tell you that will make big change in the local community. We have a program where we're going to build a model school in every rural area with access to the internet, with the new technologies, the TV white space. Young folks can have an idea about the TV white space, where kids can learn how to code, can contribute to local community. So in agriculture area, we are planning to provide solar power energy for these farmers, because the problem is they can produce food,
but they cannot store them. Refrigeration is an issue, and electricity is a problem. So why don't you give them solar energy where they can store food and that they can sell? Also, for economic development, we are planning to open the market for export. And this can happen within, our plan is to have 4,000 employees by the end of the year, and also double that next year. But also the issue of security. I believe that with economic development, that can bring security. When people have food, they have a job, they have a training, they have a skill, few people will pick up arms and start fighting. We have an experience in Congo. I'm not gonna disclose the name of the city, but we're able to attract young folks. They love computers, they don't love guns. African don't make AK-47, but they will be attracted to computer to learn and then to contribute instead of using gun. I believe economic development will solve the issue of security.
Okay, thank you. That was 3 questions, right? All right, let me turn it over to the panel, and then I'll take another round. Nee, I take your point very well, that let's not just focus on the downside of the Central African Republic today, but that there are some opportunities that can allow us to move things forward. And so I appreciate that. It is something we were talking about in the back of the room as well. And so hopefully some of that has come through, and we'll continue to add to it. But Dr. Anderson, let me get to you, because Nee's point is an important one. Our traditional peace-building frameworks have their core elements. And typically something like agriculture is on the periphery of that framework. And so Nee's point is, what can you do? What would you do differently to bring issues such as the one that we're talking about here more centrally into the framework of peace building, particularly on a continent such as Africa, but also in a country such as the Central African Republic? I think that's a very, very important question. We constantly have to challenge ourselves of, we've been doing peace building for 50 years. Why aren't we yielding the sustainable results that we've been looking for? And so part of this is really questioning what's at the heart of our peace-building models. And I think that's where Nee's question comes in. And I'd really, really love to hear your input on that. And also what the United States as a government might be able to do and do differently on that issue. The other question was on migration patterns within the Central African Republic, and how these either adding to the conflict, maybe not, or the tensions within the country, and then regional cooperation around those issues, but also around agriculture. And then we heard from Steve and his colleague on what they're doing in the Central African Republic. And I think one of the things that stood out for me, and I think you've all kind of talked about it, but I think it came across really powerfully, was the issue of looking at agriculture within the peace-building framework, but looking across the agricultural food chain or value chain. That you really, it isn't just about going to till the land and producing your food, but looking across the entirety of the food chain if you're going to build sustainability. And then there were several other things. I don't know if, I'll start with you here, and then I'll move that way.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. It's what is at the forefront of my mind every day in my role. So I'm currently a conflict advisor in the Center for Resilience in what will soon be the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. And that's part of this broader transformation going on at USAID right now. We'll have what's called this R3 family. So Food for Peace and OFTA, our humanitarian folks, they're coming together into one bureau. Then we have this bureau focused on conflict prevention and stabilization. And then this new Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. The idea is that aid is notorious for sometimes being siloed, for not thinking about these food and agricultural investments alongside these peace building or conflict mitigation investments. And the whole reason to create this R3 family is to really create a cross-sectoral mindset that's thinking about conflict and these areas of recurrent and protracted crisis all together. We know from the peace building community, we know we need more resources and we need folks to be thinking in a problem-driven way, not in a sectoral way. And this R3 family and this restructuring is really all about that. And my own role, I was in DACHA. I was in the conflict office. I moved over as a conflict officer to this Center for Resilience, soon to be this new bureau, to exactly create those kinds of linkages so we can find the money that's left on the table in terms of how do we maximize impact? How do we think creatively? How do we pursue peace building goals and think about conflict really thoughtfully, even when we're pursuing something that's originally about a food system? You know, and so that's really where we're heading. That shift is in process. So folks like me, like this makes me very excited. This makes me get up in the morning and get to work on time, even when I'm not a morning person, and be very excited about my work because I think there's so many windows of opportunity, and we're heading towards a space institutionally where we agree that is these are these key issues we need to be addressing better, and we're trying to do so.
Thank you. Do any of you want to comment on?
Yes, maybe to add to this particular question, the model of peace building today. I think when we all acknowledge that we are faced with or we are confronted with a new type of conflict which differs from the traditional conflict that we have been addressing with particular package and so on, it's good also to give room for reflection, eventually going extra mile out of the box and look for other ways of addressing the conflict or building peace in this new framework or new conflictual framework. Having said that, my point is, I think with the conflicts which are basically rooted in, as Mark Namara stressed, in poverty and development agriculture and so on, which is, I think, the case for Central African Republic. Solutions needs to kind of, the solution we may have on the table need to include also the component of agriculture. When we go back to the Second World War and look at, for instance, the Marshall Plan, agriculture has played a critical role in the reconstruction. For sure, there were investment in the recovery of the industry to rehabilitate the economic of these countries. But there's a component of agriculture, a big component. It is even said that a big part of the money given by the U.S. was invested in agriculture. And when you look at a country like Taiwan, was like by the Second War, like any developing country, there have been also a lot of investment in agriculture sector. It has made a difference in Taiwan today. Just to say, there are lessons we have not learned enough, and we maybe tend to forget. And it's good to go back to it. It's basic, it's fundamental, but I think it can make a difference. So, a peace building model of today, basically, when it comes to conflict, internal conflict, which has some roots in agriculture or poverty, anger, and so on, needs to include the component of agriculture.
Michelle, do you want to touch the question on the migration patterns? I thought that was a really interesting question. I don't know what you are seeing on the ground.
Yeah, actually, the armed pastoralism, I'll call it that way, is has been cited among the causes of conflict as well, because as observer, there's frequent clashes. We are almost coming to the dry season, so when cattle headers will go looking for grazing space, and we might face this sort of conflict on the ground. So actually, when I was mentioning about continue to work towards creating space of dialogue and collaboration, I mean, this issue of farmer and herders conflict is very crucial. We are starting a small-scale intervention in the northeast part of Central African Republic, which is actually the program deals with agriculture actually, with FAO, and Search for Common Ground is in charge to work with the communities first of all to prepare them for that, so that they should have put in place some mechanism on the field on how to solve this conflict. And knowing that when they will come, they will start planting their crops actually, they will have situation where cattle headers will come through, and this has always happen, might cause some conflict actually. So for some decades now, actually, the farmer herders conflict has been very kind of rampant in CAR. There's a lot of literature in regard to that, but meaningful action have been taking place so far when it comes to dealing specifically with this conflict. We at Search for Common Ground, we inspire ourselves from experience that of similar contests in Mali and also in Nigeria, where we have similar conflicts, to see how we can transpose it and start implementing, the same approach in CAR in order to address this issue of pastoralism.
I think there's a second dimension to your question, which was around the regional cooperation, around the migration issues. I don't know enough about the Central African Republic and how the regional cooperation around the migration issue is playing out, but I do know that at the larger continental level, there are a number of efforts on regional cooperation around migration amongst the different regional groups. But I think what you're imploring us to do is to take a look more closely about how this is playing out within the Central Africa region, particularly so much displacement, both internally and at the refugee level, but also with the farmer herder issues that are also reflected in that society. So that's a really good point to make. Let me take a couple more questions. I'll take the gentleman over here, and then I'll take the gentleman over there.
Thank you so much. I am Muhammad Al-Bahi, Minister Plenipotentiary in the Embassy of Sudan in Washington. Coming back, please, to the issue of conflict between herders and farmers, which came within the second speaker, Mr. Mombe. I hope that I pronounce it rightly. I just would like to have more elaboration on that, because in my mind that if, for example, we focus on agricultural extension in peace building in the Central African Republic, we might be addressing the problem of farmers, while at the same time we are neglecting the issue of herders. So in my mind, that providing food security is not only a goal that we should be working for. There are a number of other factors. For example, to this very issue, there is securing, for example, passages for herders. Yeah. As extension of agriculture, we are also having herders who are moving from one place to another with their sheep and cattle. They need a security of passages, so that they cannot their cows and their cattle cannot go into the agriculture, and by that this is also going to be an issue of a factor for fighting again. So extension of agriculture might be a reason for fighting rather than a reason for peace building. Then we are having, for example, the factor of education, as a number of other colleagues here in the hall has already raised. There is also a settlement of displaced and the return of refugees, a lot of other factors that should be having the same priority as agricultural extension in this issue. I thank you so much.
No, thank you. Before I take the question over there, let me save my speakers a minute here because, we understand that peace building frameworks have to be comprehensive. And so we were just taking one slice of that today. Not to say that these other elements of peace building frameworks are any less important. But what we're trying to highlight here is that the agricultural sector writ large and then the agricultural extension in particular are often components that are not embedded within peace building frameworks in many African countries, actually. And that's a huge disservice when you're trying to build a sustainable peace on a continent that relies so heavily, both in terms of employment, but food security and just day-to-day survival, that when you miss that component or it's not carefully planned for and embedded within your framework, then your chances of finding a sustainable peace are low. So I want to apologize for my speakers, but we did give them a very, very narrow assignment. This is not a critique of the larger peace building frameworks, but your point is well taken. And also on your second point about making sure we account for the farmers and the herders, it was raised earlier on, and so we're talking agriculture in general, but we do understand that you need to unpack what that sector looks like and make sure that you're being inclusive of all these different dimensions. So I just wanted to reassure you of that. Let me take the gentleman over there, and then I'll take, I already had you, my brother. I'll take Tammy over here, and I thought I saw one more hand. Okay, so very quickly, just 30 seconds so we can give them a minute each to respond to one.
My name is Donald Friend. I'm a National Academy of Sciences Jefferson Science Fellow serving the Office of Global Climate Change at USAID. Something I've heard nobody say today is the underlying climate stressors that drive all these changes in agriculture writ large. And I would love to hear what you all have to say about that. Are you working with that and considering that, and are some of the strategies drought-resistant plants, better linings for agriculture, for water canals, on and on, all these kinds of things? Because one of the drivers of conflict always is the competition for resources. Okay. And the resources at the most basic level are under great stress because of climate changes occurring certainly all over the globe, but in that region of the continent. I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Oh, okay. You're all going to have to work with me now. I did forget about you. I saw you early on. So I'll take the gentleman over there, come over here, and wrap it up over here. 30 seconds, please. Sorry.
My question is really about whether you have anything really specific that you've seen as examples. I know that in Central America, there's an institute called Zamorano in Honduras. It's been established since 1940, it's middle of the 40s or maybe the late 40s. And they train young people to be agriculturalists. And it's a very good program from what I understand. And there's a lot of links to universities and even high schools in this country. And I'm wondering if there is any example of that in Central African Republic or in a nearby country.
All right. Just give the mic to the gentleman next to him, and then we just bring it out this way. And then I'm going to give you a minute each. So think about the question you want to answer.
Hi, my name is Paul Johnson. I'm with Shaladi Associates Incorporated, and we are currently working on a few projects in West Africa on the food security and resilience programs in Niger and Burkina Faso and Senegal. And some of those programs have addressed building institution and linking the farmers to the markets and developing the value chains. And they've proven to be very successful in building capacities of these extension agencies, of these communities and the links to the government agencies. My question is USAID considering rolling out such similar programs in Central CAR, and also with regards to youth? I think this gentleman over here briefly touched upon the youth and the importance of involving youth in such development, because they are the ones that are behind some of this conflict. You know, they have no jobs and no income, and incorporating youth in any sort of development is key to resolving these conflicts. Thank you.
Okay.
Tammy Holtman from All Africa. Just a quick possible clarification. It may be that the concept of agriculture extension as a set of services to people could be confused with meaning expanding of agricultural land at the expense of farmers and herders. So I just wanted to
Very good point. We're so in the weeds on this one that we understand it, but there's a possible confusion there. So good point. Thank you. The gentleman over, no, you've already spoken. I think that was it. The gentleman over here.
Oh, okay, I'm Malik. I have worked in several countries in Africa. I'm basically an agriculture person, and I worked for Extension. I have a devil's advocate type question right now. I have not heard you say the cause of conflict. I sense there are a number of things in Africa which cause this conflict. One is artificial borders, like tribes are divided. So there is a conflict between countries, between tribes. And then there is elite capture. So if my tribe is dominant, I'll dominate. All services go there. Other people start out to fight against me. And then there are people in my neighboring countries and globally who will encourage that conflict, because that helps us steal resources. So problems are not just like addressing, going and giving a kid a toffee candy, saying, now we have taken care of your caloric need and everything will disappear. The problem will stay there as long as we have not addressed the cause of the conflict. It's.
Okay. All right.
I think this is probably enough.
And you and I can have a separate discussion about that after the event, because I happen to take a slightly different view on that. I mean, I think the continent has evolved greatly since the early days of independence. The ethnic manipulation by political elites differs from country to country. It's easier in some countries. Ethnicity and is not in and of itself a problem on the African continent. The issue comes in when there is political manipulation of that ethnicity. And so I think we need to be very careful about how we frame when difference becomes an issue. And so we can have that discussion. Let me do this.
Even this pastoral issue is an international issue. Confined to one country in Africa.
Exactly.
No, we understand. Yes, no, absolutely. We understand that. So let me do this. I know my AV people are looking at me. Just give me 3 minutes. Sorry, I apologize, and will do this. I will start with Dr. Anderson, come to you, Mr. May, and then finish with Father Pat. 1 minute each. Pick any of the questions you want to go with, or a final word that you want to leave us with.
I'll touch on the climate question, which I thought was great. So it is the case that today, unfortunately, food insecurity is on the rise for the first time in decades, and conflict and climate are the top two key drivers for why that is the case. So with my work, for instance, we'll do a risk and resilience assessment when we're going into a new place. That is predominantly, there's a lot of attention to climate risks in that calculation. The Center for Resilience is currently absorbing the climate adaptation team from the E3 Bureau into our work. And actually the early resilience cases were more about drought in contexts where climate risks and these factors were just very front and center. I do push back a little bit sometimes, because when it comes to me as the conflict advisor, at that point, we've done the risk and resilience assessment. We understand what's going on. From an agricultural perspective, we might want to think about more drought-resistant crops and things like that. But as the conflict advisor, we fundamentally have these man-made problems, and they're generally political problems. And resolving those involves collective problem solving. It involves trust. It involves information sharing. So on the one hand, I completely agree with you, big picture. By the time it gets to me as the conflict advisor, I'm dealing with very human problems that the role of the climate risk in specific falls away a bit, and it's about figuring out how do we manage resource scarcity, competition, and get folks to solve collective action problems, basically.
Right. Thank you. I think it's really about making the distinction between the big picture strategic stuff and then the technical and operational thing about how you realize that end goal. But both of those pieces need to articulate, I think is the point that you're making.
Yeah, I'll still remain on that question related to the climate change, actually. Regard to actually, just to give some concrete example of what we do in the field. Like, whenever we talk about pastoralism, actually, conflict between herders and farmers, most of the time, herders looking for grazing space and for water for their cattle, they don't usually find it, actually. So they don't follow the routes because the government in CAR, as well as other government in different countries like Niger, Nigeria, and Mali, we are having the same issue of this this conflict. Not armed pastoralism the other way, but we are dealing with herders and farmers conflict. They usually have some sort of collaborative approach in between parties to let them know, to let herders know where they're supposed to walk, what are the routes of transhumance that they're supposed to follow. So what makes the conflict now is that they don't follow that because due to climate change, the point of water they had last year is drought. There's nothing there. So they have to move to interlands, violating farmers, crops and farms, and therefore it's a source of conflict, actually. So that's why we see stress on the fact that, bearing in mind all those aspects, it's really important to, at a certain point, to get in and to bring people to discuss, because there's some quite good example and case studies in Nigeria and Mali as well, where actually when herders are getting inside a zone, the farmers of that area have already planted some signs. Maybe those are plastics. They know where to follow to reach where they're supposed to have the grazing space and water for the cattle. Yeah.
Father Pat, you have 1 minute to bring us home.
3 points in 1 minute. First point is about the youth. To say that there's currently a program run by the government of Central African Republic with its partners from the Europe, a kind of group, European setting, to create centers for the training of the youth in agriculture. So there's a response to that. The question of Ambassador, I want just to touch and link it with the issue of climate. Behind the crisis in Central Africa, the group, the different group, the SELEC and so on, there's the issue of herder and pastoralists. And you can see, for instance, among the leaders of the armed groups at the moment, we have 3 or 4 who are from foreign countries, Cameroon, Niger, and so on. And they all belong to the group of the Fulani, who are from Central Africa till Guinea-Conakry. So there's this issue, the impact of climate is going to make that the space for mobile kind of pastoralism going to be reduced and going to be a source of problem. They tend to go towards the south and in the process enter in conflict with others and so on. So there's an element of that. Point of concept, my intuition with regard to extension is to go back to the basic institution and to go back how agriculture extension started and so on. When you look at the history in the US, it started with a group of farmers who wanted to improve the activities, building on the development in science and so on. It started like that, and it has evolved with time, embracing other dimensions and so on. So I look at extension as this framework to reach out to farmers and allow them to improve their activity and have better return, better productivity, better return, and also have a climate sensibility and so on. And within this framework, unfortunately, I did not have a chance to show my conceptual framework of agriculture extension. But within this framework, there's also the issue of climate that can be addressed and so on. It's about creating, we are talking about rejuvenating extension. So we give it a dimension as we respect the initial intuition and so on. So in a nutshell, that's what I can say. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think Tammy understands and agrees with you. She just wants us to make sure we define that up front for people who may not be familiar with the concept, so that they don't think we're trying to just expand agriculture. With that, let me thank, first of all, our three speakers for a wonderful job this afternoon. Dr. Anderson for the part, and Mr. Mbey, thank you so much for joining us here today. And then thank you to all of you for coming here and engaging on a country that I feel does not necessarily get all the attention that it deserves. And on an issue that we need to really elevate this issue to the extent that we can, both the Central African Republic itself, but how you build peace in the Central African Republic and how perhaps you take a non-traditional approach to doing that. So thank you to all of you for coming here and joining us for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're gonna take a photo.